I have a question that I would like you to consider. You are Dante Alighieri, and you are about to write a great epic in which you take your readers through the length and breadth of the Catholic medieval universe. Who are you going to choose to be your guide? Now, if you haven't read the Inferno already, you might have thought, well, if I were Dante, I would choose a figure from the Bible, perhaps from the Old Testament, Abraham or Moses or David. From the New Testament, you might choose Peter or Paul. You might even choose Jesus himself. If not someone from the Bible, certainly one of the great Christian theologians, perhaps Augustine, or even better, Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica basically gives the philosophical and theological foundation to Dante's Divine Comedy. But Dante did not choose any of these. He chose instead a pagan Christian poet who died in 19 BC, about 15 years before the birth of Christ. A poet who obviously knew nothing about Christianity, but almost surely knew nothing about Judaism either. Certainly had not read the Old Testament. I speak, of course, of Virgil, the epic poet of the Aeneid. To understand why Dante chose Virgil as his guide through the Inferno and most of the Purgatory is to understand not only something about Dante's great epic, but something about the Middle Ages that created that epic. I want to discuss three reasons. First of all, on the simplest level, the reason that Dante chooses Virgil is because Dante wants to make it clear that just as Homer passed the epic baton down to Virgil, so Virgil is now going to pass the epic baton down to Dante. Even though 1,300 years separate Virgil's Aeneid from Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante wants to make it clear that the movement from Homer to Virgil to Dante, Iliad and Odyssey, to the Aeneid, to the Divine Comedy, is a smooth and even obvious one. If you want to make everybody know that you're writing the next great epic, it's good to have Virgil on your side. But there's another reason in terms of poetry. Book 11 of the Odyssey is the book where Odysseus goes to the underworld. In Book 6 of the Aeneid, Aeneas goes to the underworld. Now Dante's Inferno will be an entire book that is a trip through the underworld. What better guide than Virgil himself? And it's kind of interesting because there is a distinction between Virgil, the poet who wrote the Aeneid, and Aeneas, the character who goes through the trip of the underworld in Aeneid Book 6. But for Dante, he is both Dante the poet and Dante the pilgrim. How great to have Virgil on your side, because he not only is the last great poet to give us a journey or descent into the underworld, in a very real sense, he knows what is down there. Well, that's the first level, the sort of poetic or aesthetic level. But there's a deeper reason why Dante chooses Virgil as his guide. Dante's Divine Comedy is an allegory in which one thing represents something else. In the Inferno particularly, Virgil is not only the last great epic poet, he is an allegory for human reason. And not just human reason on its own, but the farthest that human reason can reach apart from divine grace. In Christian theology, we make a distinction between general revelation and special revelation. General revelation is the way God speaks through all people, through nature, his creation, through conscience, through things like dreams and myth and poetry. Special revelation is the way that God speaks directly through the Old and New Testament, through the prophets, and supremely through Christ himself. Now, Virgil did not have access to special revelation, but for Dante and his fellow medievals, Virgil went as far as he could based on the general revelation of creation and imagination and conscience. In fact, what Virgil embodies in the Inferno and also in the Purgatory is a perfect embodiment of the classical pre-Christian virtues of courage, temperance, wisdom, and justice. By the power of those classical virtues, Virgil will be able to lead Dante up purgatory right back to the Garden of Eden. But once he gets there, Virgil reaches the limit of his discernment, and he must pass the baton to Beatrice, a woman who embodies divine grace, who embodies the three Christian or theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, or in the King James Version, faith, hope, and charity. But there's one step that is even yet deeper. Not only did the medievals see Virgil as an embodiment of the farthest human reason can go apart from divine grace, they saw him quite literally as a proto-Christian, as someone whom the God of the Bible used, without him knowing it, to prepare the Greco-Roman pagan world for the coming of Christ and Christianity. In fact, some of you that know Latin will know that the proper spelling of Virgil is V-E-R-G-I-L. But on your book cover, it is spelled V-I-R-G-I-L. Why? Because that's a medieval pun. Virgil with an I is a combination of Virgil, spelled in the proper Latin, and the Latin word virga, V-I-R-G-A, which means a wand, like a magician's wand. Virgil, spelled with an I, is a reference to Virgil as a sort of white magician, a proto-Christian who, again, prepared the pagan world for the coming of Christ. I'm sure that some of you who are Christian may have once done that thing where you want to know God's direction in your life, and you're too lazy to pray for it. So you flip open your Bible, look at the first verse, and decide that is what God is trying to say to you. Well, that's not really a good way of discerning God's will. But do you know that in the Middle Ages, Christians actually did that with Virgil's Aeneid? They would flip it open, point to the first Latin verse that their eye fell upon, and use that as a way to discern God's will. That's how highly they held Virgil in esteem. But it wasn't just his Aeneid. It wasn't just the almost proto-Christian virtues that the Aeneid established for the early Roman Empire and later on Christianity. About 10 years before he started writing the Aeneid, in about 40 BC, Virgil wrote a series of 10 eclogues, pastoral poetry, celebrating the countryside. Most of them are about shepherds and sheep and living close to nature. But in the fourth of those eclogues, suddenly the tone changes and Virgil waxes prophetic. He speaks of the coming of a divine child who will bring peace to the world, who will bring justice and plenty and bring fathers and sons together. I would encourage you to Google Virgil's fourth eclogue. If you read it and kind of mentally scratch out any reference to the gods, you will think that you're reading a messianic prophecy straight out of the book of Isaiah. Now, of course, Virgil didn't have Christ in mind. He probably had the young Octavian, who would someday become Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and the guy who wanted him to write the Aeneid. But Christians believe that without knowing it, he was prophesying the birth of the Christian Messiah, who would be born only 15 years after Virgil died. You see, in the same way that Caesar Augustus proved a Messiah, an anointed one to the Romans, so Jesus proved to be a Messiah not just for the Jews and Christians, but for the whole world. Now, why is this important? It is not only important because it will help you understand the high esteem in which Dante held Virgil, but there's another reason. You are attending Houston Baptist University, a school who includes as one of its mission statements, what we call the 10 pillars, the desire to bring Athens and Jerusalem together. What that means is we want to combine the Greco-Roman heritage that came out of Athens with the Judeo-Christian heritage that comes out of Jerusalem. In Dante's decision to make Virgil his guide, he literally brings together all that is best in the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian tradition. This is truly a book for the mission of Houston Baptist University.